The idea was suggested to me to make presets using my favorite controller mappings. I thought about this for a while because there are so many possibilities with controllers that could be life-altering in certain contexts. I ended up deciding to focus on some relatively simple configurations that I keep coming back to because they're great starting points. My goal here is to show you that relatively few controllers can nudge a whole lot of life into your sounds, and making your own setups from scratch doesn't have to be daunting. These are not necessarily staples or the only thing or the best thing. These are just tricks that I use fairly often. Later in this video, we're going to expand out to playing some soft synths in Ableton, and we're not going to go too deep into that world. I just wanted to include that world in the starting points video because bringing melodic sequences into the experience helps give context to what we're doing here. So let's talk kick and snare and get something cooking quick. Honestly, I find that in a lot of situations, it's better not to have a kick too dynamic. So I tend to keep the kick velocity I/O fairly logarithmic with this loud curve. Modulating kick samples can get pretty squirrely if we're not careful, and we don't want to sacrifice the low end of our beat sonics. To get some musicality into the kick without tampering with that support, I like to use two samplers for two different roles. This first one just serves to keep those bassy frequencies present. It doesn't have much attack. I'm even exaggerating this by putting a little bit of a slow attack on the sample. So disabling this other sampler, this sample really is just a subby woof. This subtle shaving off of the transient isn't really necessary, but it is pretty cool with this sample, and I'm really just trying to illustrate the point of using two different samplers for two different roles. The other sampler's role is to bring the attack into the sound. This sample is all attack, and the velocity curve is set up that it really smacks with the hardest velocities, and we still get some with medium velocities, but not all that much. And if you notice, we're not going to hear the sample at all with the softer velocities, leaving us with just this subby sound. So I'll bring up my threshold window so you can see my dynamics. Nice. It might be helpful to think of this two-sampler approach in terms of miking a kick with a kick in and kick out mic. Instead of getting one mic to do it all, use two to play each roll really well and then mix to taste. And in this case, we're going to mix to taste using velocity. For snare, I actually find it really intuitive to modulate pitch with velocity, except I like to invert the range so that our minimum value is higher than the maximum value. This means that when I play soft, the snare sound is going to pitch up quite a bit. And when I play harder, we get back to the original pitch of the sample. This feels super utilitarian to me because if we pitch the snare up high enough, it plays the role of a hi-hat sonically to my ears. The thing to be mindful of here is that we really need the pitch of the backbeat to be consistent, because if our backbeat is pitchy, things start to feel liquidy, and that's really not my vibe. The way to ensure that without just smacking the tar out of your drum is to bring this sensitivity down so that we're more likely to snap to the maximum value, which in this case is the lowest pitch. It's maybe not a big deal to some, but it really bothers me. That ensures that we get the same pitch on the backbeat every time. Taking it just a little bit further, I like to use center to edge on a timbre controller to modulate the start time of the sample. Cutting off the transient makes the sound less impactful, just like an acoustic snare would sound thinner as it's played towards the edge. Again, we want to ensure that we can get the full transient back every time we want a backbeat. So in this case, that would mean moving this sensitivity slider on the left up so that we're more likely to snap to the minimum value, which in this case is the full sample. So oftentimes, this is as far as I'll go with drum sounds for an initial setup. I think it's really important to keep momentum when creating something so you avoid the pitfall of spending too much energy on non-essentials. Don't get me wrong, sound design is a valid end in its own right, but if I'm in more of a compositional mindset, I want to get to the big picture, and endless tweaking can quickly stifle my creative flow. And I can always circle back to do some deeper sound design if need be. To explore a more compositional space quickly with sensory percussion, one of my go-tos is to throw LFOs on start times of long melodic samples. For this kit, I left it blank because I want you to throw your own samples into all of this stuff. But if you want to try something that I made, you can try out this next kit where I took a recording of an old piano song of mine and put it on both toms. Note the different pitches and the different LFOs. Notice that they're in a choke group together so things don't go awry. And I also put a snap sound on the rim with that choke group. This leans really heavily on randomness, but I will usually record these explorations and harvest bits and pieces, whether that be resampling cool moments from the recording or recreating some melody or chord progression that came out of the randomness that stuck out to me. I really love throwing myself into setup with lots of chance variables like this. It starts to feel like improvising with other musicians in the sense that you're reacting to the results. I find that often leads to good places. Okay, let's explore another setup. For this, I'm using more of a beat-making mindset. We're not going to use velocity for dynamics very much. However, we can use velocity for other nuances that would be really hard to do with an MPC or the pencil tool. The kick, again, very logarithmic velocity response. Another way I like to play with the attack on a kick sound is to use samples that don't necessarily have a crazy attack sound, but then use an envelope controller to modulate the pitch of the sample. So with this is just a decay envelope, relatively short. It's going to jump way up, depending on how hard I hit the kick, and then quickly ramp down to its original pitch. When I play soft, it just sounds like this nice little dive in the pitch, but when I play harder, that dive starts to feel like a nice clicky attack. I think this approach works better for more electronic feeling kicks, but use your own discretion. For snare, again, we're going to use a super logarithmic loud response, so velocity isn't changing the volume of the sample all that much. What we can do with velocity to add some variation instead is use it to modulate the length of the sample. So in this case, when I play soft, it's going to be a really short little blip, and then as I play harder, we hear the full sample. I like how this sounds like skidding when you do a buzz. If you want to take it further, a nice next step is to also use velocity to modulate the filter cutoff. This is going to start getting in a more dynamic zone, but rather than actually suppressing the amplitude of the sample, we're just going to cut out high frequencies. So now those short sounds with softer velocities are also going to be more dull sounding because we're cutting out some of the high end. I should also mention that I'm using a speed controller on pitch, but it only comes into play when I play really fast, so basically just a buzz. And that's probably really contributing to that skidding sound. I like it. One more thing I'm doing with velocity here, I wouldn't do this all the time, but in this particular setup, I thought it was really cool, is using velocity to reverse the sample. So now, not only are my soft velocities going to make the sample short and more dull, but it's also going to make it play backwards. In this kit, I have some hi-hats going on Tom 2, which for me is drum 4. I find it best to not tamper with the sound of cymbals too much. I mean, like the pitch and filter that starts to get liquidy. Modulating the amplitude is cool, like the decay time or even the attack in some cases, but generally I don't do anything too heavy-handed. One thing that we can do for this aesthetic we're going for with this kit is actually utilize the looping functionality and modulate the number of repeats for some nice ratchets. With this velocity controller over here, harder velocities are going to introduce a couple more loops, so when I play soft, just one note at a time, and then when I play harder, start ratcheting. And I have the sensitivity set. I have to play pretty hard to get any ratchets at all, but you can bring this down to taste. I actually like that better. If you're feeling adventurous, which I often am, and you probably are because you like sensory percussion, another way you can approach ratchet bursts is to modulate the length of the sample while it's looping. And because it's looping, the length is also going to determine the speed of the loop. Modulating this with velocity, it's going to be completely ungridded and really glitchy. I have this on the rim of Tom 2, by the way. I honestly love this trick, and you can literally hear this on 3 out of the 4 songs in the EP I just released. One final trick for this kind of beat vibe is to sidechain the volume of the cymbals against the kick. In this kit, I have a cymbal on the rim of my snare, and instead of using a compressor and sidechaining it to the kick and the effects, I've actually gravitated towards just using an envelope and modulating volume of the sampler with it. So this is an envelope on my kick, and whenever I play the kick, it will pump the volume of this sampler over here. I like using envelopes because I have a ton of control that's really intuitive to taper the curve of this pumping. I also have a theory that using an envelope is more CPU efficient than using a compressor, but I don't know if that's true. Just a hunch. To take this setup to a melodic compositional space, we can utilize another super simple yet extremely powerful trick, which is cycling. On the toms, I have 2 short lists of samples. Tom 1 has 2 chords that cycle nicely, and then Tom 2 has 3 vibraphone samples that cycle nicely as well. I'm a big fan of samplers cycling simultaneously with different numbers of samples. In this case, we have a nice 2 against 3 permutation phasing thing just begging to be explored. So if I play them at the same time, they're going to phase in a 2 against 3 thing that we're probably all used to in our choppy rudiment zone. Except now we can apply that choppy stuff to a compositional mindset, which I really like. This can get really dense if you start playing the toms in different correlations. Say I was to play a left-right-right sticking. This introduces a completely different phase relationship. This is a very minimalistic setup, but we can get a ton of different results out of it by exploiting those different phase relationships. I really love exploring this kind of thing while also playing a beat. Again, it feels like improvising with another musician, except in this sense, I guess you're kind of just improvising with the math of it all. Okay, so let's go back to this first set that we used and hop over to Ableton. I wanted to include melodic approaches using Ableton Live in this video because it offers a completely different tool set for composition. In these two examples, I'm using my MIDI sample and hold devices, which allow us to use a MIDI sequence for pitches, but we can use the rhythm coming from sensory percussion for the rhythmic information. I find this to be a really flexible way to play synths while having total control over what pitches happen and when. With this chord voices example, we're using each drum to pick out a different voice in the chord. So if I scroll through these different chains, you can see this chord voice selector has selected a different voice. And I have all of these playing a simple wavetable setup. So if I launch this scene, we can get that sequence going. In the second example, we're actually using 3 different sequences, one for the kick, one for tom 1, and then another for tom 2. And then all 3 of these drums are playing a different synthesizer. One cool thing about this approach is that it opens up the possibility of using sequences of different lengths to get some of that permutation stuff going like we did with the sample cycling. We could obviously go way deeper on the Ableton side of things to interact with these synthesizer timbres more. That's not the point of this video. I just wanted to illustrate how you can take just a few controllers on the sensory percussion side, pair them with some melodic elements, and you're already well on your way to a compelling composition. Thanks for watching. See you later.